Thank you very much. We are very pleased to have our final session for our Forum on Free Speech on campus this afternoon. It is our privilege to have with us for a conversation about the congressional perspective the senior senator from Tennessee, Lamar Alexander, and the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, Rod Rosenstein. Senator Alexander serves as the chairman of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and also as chairman of the Senate Energy, Water, and Water Development Appropriations Subcommittee. First elected to the U.S. Senate in 2002, Senator Alexander had a distinguished career in public service prior to that. The voters of Tennessee twice elected him governor, and he led that state from 1979 to 1987. He also served as president of the University of Tennessee from 1988 to 1991, and as the Attorney General noted this morning, that was back when the university won football games. He served as George H.W. Bush's Secretary of Education from 1991 to 1993, so he knows a lot about the issues we are discussing today. We are so pleased that he has made time to join us. Thank you, Senator Alexander. We're also privileged to have our Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein. A graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard Law School, Mr. Rosenstein began his legal career clerking for Judge Douglas Ginsburg of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. Soon after, he joined the Department of Justice through the Honors Program and began prosecuting public corruption cases. Since then, he has served in leadership in both the criminal and tax divisions here in Main Justice, and later for 12 years as the United States Attorney for the District of Maryland. The Senate confirmed him as the 37th Deputy Attorney General of the United States in April of 2017. It is my pleasure to introduce the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on Constitution Day to discuss a topic central to the rule of law in America. I want to say a special thanks to Jesse Panuccio, who is our acting Associate Attorney General, and his team for putting together a superb agenda and inviting so many superb speakers. More than a decade elapsed between the adoption of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, a decade during which our citizens devoted significant attention to the question of how best to secure the blessings of liberty. On this 231st anniversary of the Constitution, we properly praise the written document for establishing the framework of liberty, but the Constitution obviously did not write itself, nor did it take effect automatically. The drafters engaged in a lengthy debate about first principles, and the people carefully considered the terms before accepting them. Their decision reflected free thought, and it required free speech. As Jesse described it this morning, freedom of speech was a precondition for the American Republic. Listening to contentious debate and engaging rhetorically with opponents is at the heart of our nation. As Thomas Jefferson wrote, wherever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. And whenever things get so far wrong as to attract their notice, they may be relied upon to set them to rights. Thanks to the open exchange of ideas and concerns, a consensus developed in 1787 that America needed a new form of government. The founders chose a democratic republic governed by the rule of law. The rule of law was the subject of Abraham Lincoln's first published speech. He prophetically titled it "The Perpetuation of Our Democratic Institutions." The year was 1838. The founding fathers had passed away, and Lincoln was alarmed by the sharp political divisions of his era. He advocated building respect for the law as a way to hold society together. 2 decades later, in 1858, Lincoln engaged in a series of debates with his Senate opponent, Stephen Douglas. The opening speaker addressed the audience for 1 hour. The opponent then took an hour and a half to reply. Then the first debater spent another half hour to respond. People disagreed, sometimes vehemently, but they listened patiently, and they learned about opposing arguments. That sometimes messy process remains essential because our system of government is not self-executing. It relies on wisdom and self-restraint. In a democratic republic, liberty is protected by cultural norms as well as by constitutional text. Theodore Roosevelt observed that the survival of a republic depends on the character of the average citizen. He said that the average citizen must be a good citizen if our republics are to succeed. Debates and disagreements about public policy and political leadership are essential to building good citizens. The question for today's forum is how to respond when college administrators seek to prohibit or even to punish speech protected by the Constitution. On college campuses, ideally, students hear about different perspectives. They test conflicting arguments, and they learn how to decide for themselves what is true, what is right, and what is just. And to do that properly, colleges must expose students to a range of alternatives. And I say that as a parent who just sent my first child off to college, and I expect her to learn a wide range of alternatives and learn how to make her own decisions and choose from among conflicting ideas. And yet we repeatedly hear about examples of hostility to free speech and viewpoint diversity on college campuses. Professors, students, and guest speakers are shouted down and even physically attacked for expressing their views or in an effort to prevent them from expressing their views. As Attorney General Sessions said this morning, suppression of competing voices is not the American way. Our next speaker brings considerable expertise and experience to this forum. A graduate of Vanderbilt University and the New York University School of Law, Senator Lamar Alexander spent a large portion of his life in and around campuses. His mother was a school teacher, and his father was a school principal. He rose to become the Secretary of Education and then a university president. While not serving in government, he worked as a lawyer and as an entrepreneur. But during his successful campaign for governor in 1978, Senator Alexander was known for walking across his home state of Tennessee, dressed in casual attire, to engage his fellow citizens in face-to-face conversations about public policy. He repeated that approach when he ran for president in 2000, driving across the country in an SUV. In 2002, he won election to the United States Senate, where he serves as the chairman of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. He continues to devote substantial time and attention to the issues of free speech in higher education. Senator Alexander well understands the importance of education and the role of free speech in supporting it. So please join me in welcoming Senator Alexander to discuss the congressional perspective about free speech on college campuses. Thank you. Thank you, sir. As we were walking down here this afternoon, Senator Alexander pointed out to me that in addition to the parts of his biography that I mentioned to you, he actually was an intern here in the Department of Justice many, many years ago, 50 some odd years ago, and still has fond recollections of that experience. And sir, let me start out by asking you, when was it in your career that you first became interested in the issue of free speech on campus?
Well, it was late in my career. I suppose I noticed it when I was a student at Vanderbilt, and the John Birch Society wanted my political science professor fired because they said he was a communist, and they didn't fire him. I guess I noticed at that time at the University of Texas a big fight between the conservative Board of Regents and the liberal professors. As Joe Biden has said, for people our age, most of the ferment on this issue came with conservatives trying to suppress liberals in the 1960s. And as Joe says, it's now switched to the other side. So I guess, come to think of it, when I was a student at Vanderbilt.
Now, you mentioned, Senator, that in some respects, shouting down speakers on campuses or trying to suppress opposing views is not a new issue. We talked earlier about the incident in the University of Chicago in the 1930s when the chairman of the Communist Party was prevented from speaking. There was the incident in the 1960s at the University of Wisconsin where Senator Kennedy, one of your colleagues, was heckled. And more recently at Middlebury College, the assault on a professor, Allison Stanger. Is there anything different about the challenges we face today compared to those of the past?
Well, what's different today is the iPhone, which I gave mine away before I sat down. But I mean, it's revolutionized all forms of activity, including all of our politics. But the principles are the same. And let me give you a story that illustrates today. Susan Collins is, I guess you'd fairly say, the most moderate Republican senator. She was invited to go to a Northeastern university to speak not long ago. Several students told the administration that if she were allowed to speak without meeting with them first, they would disrupt her speech. The administration caved into that request, and Susan met with them, which she didn't really think she should have to do. And then she made the speech. What the administration did was to allow the students to exercise what Nadine Strawson, who is here, would call the heckler's veto. It allowed those students to prevent, or to threaten to prevent, a United States senator with whom they disagreed from speaking on their college campus. What the administration did that was wrong was caving into that. What it should have said is, you may not attend, you may cross your arms, you may even turn around and look the other way, you might even hiss and boo occasionally, but if you disrupt her speech and you prevent others from hearing her, you'll be punished because you have no right under the First Amendment to do that. So that's not a new issue. That's been around for a long time. What we have is the iPhone devices, which stirs things up better. But what we need is for college administrators to know the rules and to know they should veto the heckler's veto and make it clear at the beginning of school that you can't, this is what you can do and this is what you can't do.
Senator, you mentioned your own experience with a professor who was criticized for his political views. There are some who say that conservatives only care about free speech when the voice is being suppressed or on the conservative side of the spectrum. How do you respond to that?
Well, maybe there's some truth to that, but they don't have much chance to worry about it because, I mean, historically, college campuses everywhere in the world are more liberal in orientation. That's just the nature of things. I mean, UCLA did a survey of professors in the United States, 6-to-1 liberal to conservative. The more disturbing thing today is the Brookings Institution that says that half the college students today believe it's okay to disrupt a speech, which you find offensive, and 20% believe it's okay to use violence to disrupt a speech. That's what's different, and that needs to be challenged.
Senator, there was a recent poll, a Pew poll, that found that 58% of Republicans believe that college has a negative effect on American life, and I believe it found the reverse for Democrats. What do you attribute that to? This
issue. I mean, now think about that for a minute. We have almost all the best colleges in the world in the United States. Most people agree with that. Second, we're at a time when many people, I'd say most people, believe that you need more, not less education to get the technical skills that you need to have a good standard of living. So despite that, you've got 58% of the party that controls the presidency and the Congress thinking colleges, and we have 6,000 of them, of one kind or another, have a negative effect on American life. I think it's because of two things. One is the feeling that conservative views are underrepresented on campus, and second, that campuses coddle students through such things as speech codes, triggers that warn them of something offensive that might come along. I mean, the idea that a student who graduates from a college should not be prepared to deal with an offensive tweet in the morning and needs to be trained to retreat to some safe place is the kind of thing that would cause a lack of support for institutions. So I think the lack of support among Republicans for colleges right now is directly related to the feeling that conservative views are underrepresented.
Did you develop, during your time as an administrator or otherwise, did you develop a sense of what the ideal of the university is, and in what way do you think it could be adversely affected by this free speech issue?
Well, I guess I've learned by listening to others You know, I came to Washington with a senator named Howard Baker, who was a wonderful man, and he had a phrase that said, the other fellow might be right, which is applicable to this discussion. But I guess I've learned from other campuses more how to deal with this than I understood when I was president of the University of Tennessee. For example, the president of Chicago, the University of Chicago, and his senior faculty have adopted the Chicago Principles, which is really a restatement of what they've always believed, and they've basically said free speech is a part of the University of Chicago. The president of Princeton says, as a tactic, he tries to make having controversial speakers so routine that it's not an event. that if somebody's looking around to stir up trouble because you have a controversial speaker, they'll have to come every 3 days because that happens. So those are tactics that I've learned from. Adopting the Chicago Principles, vetoing the heckler's veto, making your campus a campus where having people of many different points of view is routine. Those are all ways, I think, to diffuse the possibility of a big explosion over free speech.
I have plenty more questions of my own, but let me just pause to invite those of you in the audience. If you have any questions, I believe you have note cards. Feel free to pass those forward. And the senator is prepared to take unscripted questions, so you should take advantage of that opportunity. Let me follow up, though, by asking you about what you think is the best pathway forward. I know you've spoken eloquently about the notion that colleges should treat intellectual diversity like other forms of diversity. Do you think colleges should support underrepresented points of view? Well,
Of course, I do, and I'm glad you asked that. I think that's probably the best thing. When I was a senior at Vanderbilt University, this was a long time ago, 1962, Vanderbilt was segregated by race. And a group of us, I was the editor of the newspaper, objected to that, stirred things up. The Board of Trustees changed the policy that year. Since then, universities have done a pretty good job of finding a whole variety of ways to take underrepresented students and making them part of a university community. For example, Vanderbilt has something called the Posse, where they find kids of limited background who would probably never even think of going to Vanderbilt University, but they select those of promise, and then they go together and they help each other. They're a posse. That's a very good way to do it. You know, you could do the same thing with points of view. Arthur Brooks, who's the head of the American Enterprise Institute, is going to Harvard. Well, that ought to stir things up a little bit at Harvard. The more of that, you know, the better. So I think if universities and campuses recognized that conservative points of view are undervalued and underrepresented and use the same sort of creativity and enthusiasm for making other points of view, conservative points of view, represented on campus that they did to make underrepresented students on campus, that'd go a long way to solve the problem.
Now, do you have in mind actually going out and recruiting students with diverse points of view, or just bringing in speakers to bring it?
Well, I think you could do it many different ways. Arthur Brooks, that's one way. I mean, if Arthur Brooks is very talented, and if Harvard students are exposed to him, they're going to learn something from him. I was on the faculty at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Dean Nye recruited me because they didn't have many Republicans who were there. Another way to do it would be to deliberately recruit students. And I hate to keep using personal examples, but the Attorney General mentioned that when I went to law school, I went to New York University. The time I went, 1962, almost everybody there was from the Bronx and Queens. And they were trying to find ways to get kids from all over the country. So they created scholarships based upon judicial districts. So they got hillbillies like me, or Swedes from Minnesota, or people from all over the country, and began to diversify the student body at NYU, and that they felt made it a richer place. So I think it's speakers, faculty members, students, just to make sure that you're not constantly exposed to one point of view.
And one of the important principles, Senator, of the Republic that we celebrate on Constitution Day is the concept of limited powers in our federal government. At the same time, though, we have a vast federal government with many powers, many departments, including education, the one with which you're very familiar. What, if anything, do you think the federal government should do? I know you're familiar with the cases that the department has filed recently as essentially supporting free speech claims by students who have been discriminated against. What more do you think the federal government could do to support free speech on campuses?
Well, I can tell you what I think the federal government should do and what it should not do. What it should do is more things like this day, more things like your statement of interest in cases that students bring, or someone brings, a private right of action alleging that free speech on campus has been violated. You know, what people might not know is that we have 6,000 colleges and universities, many of them smaller, but the average tenure for a university president in the United States is probably 3, 4, 5 years. And the average tenure for a board of trust or board trustee member is about the same. So they may not know what to do. They may not know what the law is, what the history is, what their options are. So I would suggest more of this. I would suggest that you have more regional forums sponsored by the universities themselves, in which you bring in university presidents and board of trustees members and say, here's the history, here's the law, here are your options. You can enforce you can veto the heckler's veto. You can adopt the Chicago principles. You can diversify your campus in a variety of ways. You can use the same skills to recruit underrepresented points of view that you did to recruit underrepresented students. I think that is what the federal government could do. What the federal government should not do is pass a law trying to solve all this. Conservatives don't like it when judges try to write laws. And conservatives shouldn't like it when legislators and agencies try to rewrite the Constitution. I mean, I do not want to see Congress or the president or the Department of anything defining what a speech code should be or shouldn't be, what you can say or what you shouldn't. I think what should define that is the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment and the private right of actions, and the courts of the United States should define that.
Our first question from the audience follows up actually on that issue, Senator, and asks, how do you think and who do you think in the Department of Justice or the federal government should be charged with engaging with colleges and universities to address concerns about free speech?
Well, who should? I guess the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General would be the...
We don't have enough to do.
I think it should be a 2 or 3 year process because everything in universities works slowly. But, you know, there's a building over here, Bill Bennett used to call it the Blob, where all of the universities have their associations. I think they would be happy to organize at almost every one of their meetings a forum for college presidents, and you need the presidents and the board members to say what I've said before. Here's what the history is, here's what the law is, here's what you can do, and here are your options. I think if the University of Chicago president says, here's how and why we adopted the principles, if the Princeton University president says, here's how we make controversial speech routine, if the Attorney General says, this is the state of the law, if Nadine Strawson said, here's what a heckler's veto is, and you can say at the beginning of every year, here's what you may do, here's what you may not do, and if you violate that, you'll be punished. I think that would make its way through the various campuses. The other reason not to try to do it by a federal mandate or a federal law is it doesn't work. We saw it with something called Common Core in education. All the states were using that to develop higher standards in elementary and secondary education. But as soon as the U.S. Department of Education ordered that it be done, everybody went bazooka. The black helicopters started flying, and everybody resented. And it actually backfired, and you had less effort on higher standards. So you have to have ownership in this, campus by campus.
Well, that actually, I think, suggests what your answer may be to this question, but let me pose it anyway. The question asks, Congress has passed important laws to protect First Amendment rights, such as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and the Equal Access Act. What would legislation look like to protect free speech on college campuses? The presumption there is that you would
I wouldn't want to see it, is what I would fear. I mean, if you think it's hard for a campus to write a free speech code, let's just take my committee. We have 23 members Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders to Rand Paul. So we're going to write a free speech code, what you can say, what you can't say at every campus. And then 2 years from now, maybe Nancy Pelosi's writing it. Maybe it's President Trump writing it. So then once you write a law, you have regulations, and you don't know exactly who's going to be writing those. So I don't want to see a law written by Congress that tries to define what free speech is on campus. I think we have a Constitution, we have federal courts and the U.S. Department of Justice, and we have a private action that students may bring. 80% of students go to public colleges and universities. The First and 14th Amendment applies to them, and there's plenty of opportunity there to deal with free speech.
Senator, how broad of a problem do you believe this is, the challenge of free speech on college campuses? Do you see it as a problem that's growing in significance, or simply that's attracting more attention these days?
I think it's a big problem. People might say I'm as big a defender of our system of higher education as exists in the United States Congress. I worry that this will undermine it. I mean, it's really pretty dumb to deliberately make your biggest donor unhappy, right? Most colleges and university presidents wouldn't do that. Who is the biggest donor for colleges and universities? The federal government and the taxpayers provide more than $30 billion a year for Pell Grants. They provide more than $100 billion a year for new student loans. They provide about $35 billion a year about $30 billion a year for federal research grants through the National Institutes of Health. Now, if 58% of Republicans think colleges are bad for the American way of life, that's really not very smart. If you're thinking about making your biggest donor happy. So my advice is to do all these things I've talked about: hecklers veto, Chicago principles, diversify opinion, have the forums, because it's the right thing to do. Then I believe I would go see my local United States senator and congressman and say, you may have heard that we don't have diverse views on our campus, but let me show you that we do, and let me show you all the things that we have in place to do it. I think it's a very big threat to the quality and support for higher education in the United States.
Our next question relates to that issue, Senator. Given that higher education is a pillar of our democracy, our economy, and our society, which is a view I think that you share, and that Congress does provide significant funding in various ways for universities, as you mentioned, donors can elicit particular actions that they want by conditioning their donations on actions by universities. Do you believe that Congress should do the same thing? That is, that Congress should condition funding on universities complying in some way with First Amendment principles?
No, I don't, because how would you do that? I mean, that means someone's going to have to write a definition of free speech. And I suppose Congress could, by a sense of the Senate resolution, adopt the Chicago principles, but the next Congress might adopt another set of principles. And if you pass a law, as I mentioned, then you get regulations. So I don't think Congress should do that. I think what would be another thing that would be more effective, other than the things I've described, would be for consumers to get active. Within the last 2 weeks, I think 2 national publications came out with 100 best colleges and universities. Actually, the Wall Street Journal had 300 of them rated. All of the colleges and universities object to the U.S. News and World Report rating for colleges and universities, best colleges and universities. But every single one of them brags about it when they're on the list. So if there were a consumer report organization that was bipartisan, independent, well-respected, that ranked the 100 best colleges and universities in terms of free speech and maybe the 25 worst, I guarantee you that'll have some effect.
To what extent do you think it would be appropriate or wise for parents and prospective students to consider a university's attitude toward ideological dissent in deciding whether or not to attend that particular university?
I think it's a very good idea. I mean, why would you want your kid to go to a college where he's coddled so much he or she can't live in the real world. I mean, do you want to come out of a college unable to withstand an offensive tweet, asking for a safe place to go when somebody insults you? I mean, you've got to live with the rough and tumble of the world. That's always been the case. This isn't anything new. And you've had people here today who've written about fragile students. On one campus, their students objected to the fact of studying Homer and the ancient Western literature because students might be presented with difficult and offensive information. That's true. You need to know about that because it's out there. And you're going to have to deal with it one way or the other unless you live in a cocoon once you graduate. So my idea of a college is a place that you can go, make a few mistakes, hear some points of view that you really disagree with, sharpen your ability to challenge those points of view, and come out stronger in your ability to withstand and live in a world that's very complicated.
Now, you mentioned, Senator, that when you went from Tennessee to New York City for college, you experienced an environment very different from what you were accustomed to.
Yeah.
How did that influence you, and do you have any recollections of any disputes that you had with fellow students about politics?
Oh, sure. I mean, think about this for a minute. I had never been to New York City until I enrolled in NYU University Law School. Now, if you know where NYU University Law School is, it's in Greenwich Village. And so I got one round trip a year in the scholarship I had. So I got off the plane, took a bus to Greenwich Village, looked out the window at 3 o'clock in the morning and thought, who are all these strange people? I'm in the wrong place. And then I went to school. I'm a Presbyterian from the mountains of Tennessee. 95% of the kids at NYU Law School at that time were Jewish or Roman Catholic. They came from very different backgrounds as I did. They asked me who I wanted to room with. I wrote on the list, I'd like to room with somebody from as different a background of mine as possible. I mean, I did all that deliberately so that I could learn to live in the world, and it strengthened me a lot. Now, I'm not sure I'd write that down today if I were looking for a roommate at a college or university, because maybe things have changed. But deliberately being exposed to different points of view is a part of growing up, and if you, we want a nation of leaders, actually, and a nation of neighbors who are familiar with many different points of view, can withstand them, know when to ignore them, know when to challenge them, know when to agree with them. All that is ideally what ought to be happening at a college campus.
Well, setting aside the question of whether reform should be driven by legislation or by self-help, essentially by universities, there are a number of ideas for reform, and they include things such as banning trigger warnings, creating programs to teach about respectful dialogue, and abandoning speech codes. Which, if any of these reforms, do you agree with?
I'll summarize some of the ones I've mentioned. First, I would consider adopting the Chicago principles or something like the Chicago principles on a campus. It needs to be done bottom up. The campus needs to adopt that. Two, I would get agreement from the board that governs our campus and the university administration that we veto the hecklers veto. In other words, if you're a student here, you may exercise, you may go to anything you want or not go. You may wear a shirt that says you disagree. You may turn your back. You might even hiss occasionally, but if you disrupt a speech and you make it impossible for the speaker to speak and the audience to listen, you'll be punished, period. So don't come here if you don't want to do that. And then I think a third thing to do is to be aggressive in recruiting underrepresented points of views, namely conservative views, on campus, so that students have that. And then to be practical about it, since your biggest funder is the United States government and 58% of the governing party thinks you're not good for the country, I believe I'd go tell them what you're doing and saying, come to our campus and look how we're not the stereotypical campus that doesn't allow different points of view.
So you mentioned, Senator, inviting legislators to come to campus, but you also have said that you encourage people to write to their representatives about their concerns. Do you think it's appropriate for the Congress to hold hearings when incidents arise on campuses and have a formal congressional inquiry into how these events occurred and what sort of decisions were made.
Yes, and we had a good such hearing. But you know, what I think really would make more difference if you're looking for a result, and being a former governor, I'm always looking for results. If I were a consultant to my friends who are presidents of colleges and universities, and I were worried about this, I'd develop a 3 or 5 year plan, and I would begin to schedule those forums that I talked about earlier for university presidents themselves, for members of boards of campuses, and I would have someone from the Department of Justice there to say, here's the history, here's the law, someone else to say, here are your options. Those forums would at least equip the people in charge of colleges and universities to know what to do.
And we've talked quite a bit, Senator, about the role of the Department of Justice. What about education? Do you believe the Department of Education should have a role in this?
Well, my view of the Department of Education has always been that the secretary has a wonderful bully pulpit, but he or she should not be telling colleges and schools what to do. I mean, there's 6,000 colleges, 100,000 public schools. We don't need a national school board. But I certainly think that the United States Secretary of Education could have a role in reminding university presidents and board members of all the same things I just talked about. But I think the credibility of the U.S. Department of Justice would be important here, just to say, here's the law, here's what the Supreme Court has said the First Amendment requires, and let's keep it simple. Here's what a heckler's veto is, and you can't do it. You can't do it under the law. I mean, if you just did that one thing, that'd eliminate 40% of the problems.
Well, the final question from the audience, a little bit different perspective. It asks, it seems that university departments, such as diversity and inclusion, that are aimed to empower students, are only creating entitled students. How do you respond?
That to create entitled students?
I think the import of the question is that when universities create positions or departments to encourage diversity and inclusion, do they create entitled students? They have an adverse effect on their students?
Well, the answer is yes to that. The problem is that the word diversity has become stolen. It doesn't mean diversity anymore. Diversity means a certain point of view. So it's almost a useless word. It's a wonderful word in its right sense. Diversity should mean that you have real differences of opinion allowed and expressed. Many students of different backgrounds and races and origins, and that all that's tolerated. And too often, diversity has come to mean that you have a certain point of view, and if you don't have that point of view, it's not diversity. So I think the word diversity has been stolen, really, and its meaning, as so often happens in public life today, is not what it ought to be. I guess I'd choose a different word, and the way I talk about it is to say, let's just recognize that campuses need underrepresented points of view as much as campuses need underrepresented students, and universities should work just as hard to have those underrepresented points of view, which are today, in many cases, conservative points of view on the campus. I mean, that's just a fact, and we should deal with things the way they are. That's the way they are, and we should deal with them.
Senator, I spoke too soon. We have time for one final audience question, and that is, it has some subparts to it. It's a request to expand on the idea of a forum for college presidents. Who do you think should convene it? What should be the objective? And what work product would you expect to come out of it?
Well, let me think out loud for a minute. I would have the colleges convene it, because this is a case where you want a sense of ownership. I mean, if you're talking about raising children, you know, you can tell them what to do, but until they decide for themselves what they want to do, they're not going to do it. So I think, and then when you make people go to things, they don't accept it as well as when they decide to go to things. So maybe what you do is you create a limited opportunity for a certain number of college presidents to come to a very interesting forum on this subject. And you have people like the president of Chicago and Princeton and other campuses that have dealt with this successfully, and you let presidents decide to come. I would have it sponsored by the organizations of the colleges and universities themselves. I think they'll be glad to do it. But I would make sure that on that forum is someone of the stature of the Deputy Attorney General to say, this is the law, someone of the stature of the former president of the American for Civil Liberties Union, like Nadine Strossen, who can say very clearly what the law is and what the options are. And then I think if many of the prestigious colleges do this, there'll be another 100 that say, well, maybe I ought to get on the thing too, and I would have it move through 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You accompany that with a consumer's report of the 100 colleges, and I'd make that independent. 100 colleges, the 100 best free speech campuses and the 25 worst. I think the combination of those two things could make a real difference fairly quickly.
Senator, I want to thank you for a superb segue to our next and final presentation. Very much appreciate your spending the time with us today, and also want to thank you for your longstanding and continuing commitment to education and the First Amendment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Well done.